Is this supposed to be some sort of joke? The words, biting and saturated with contempt, sliced through the lively commotion of the dock. Lieutenant Miller, his uniform so pristine it remained rigid at every fold, positioned himself directly before the elderly gentleman. He was youthful, exuding the sort of unwarranted self-assurance that accompanies a newly granted commission and a manual of regulations memorized to perfection. He examined Lawrence Owens from head to toe, conducting a deliberate, offensive assessment that registered the threadbare tweed coat, the marginally hunched posture, and the profound creases carved into a countenance that had witnessed more dawns than the lieutenant had years of existence. "Sir, this is a secured military facility, and this is the boarding ramp for the USS Courage. I require verification of your authorization to come aboard." Lawrence Owens, 89 years of age, held his position. He wasn't rebellious, simply motionless. His hands, twisted by time and recollection, lay upon the grip of an unadorned wooden walking stick. His attention wasn't directed at the hostile young officer, but rather at the massive gray expanse of the vessel rising behind him, its steel framework obscuring a portion of the vivid azure heavens. It was Fleet Week, a time of festivity, of families reconnecting, of citizens being welcomed to observe the strength and distinction of the Navy. For Lawrence, it was meant to be a return. The lieutenant exhaled, a dramatic expression of irritation for the expanding assembly of sailors and their relatives who were starting to accumulate behind the spontaneous standoff. "Sir, I don't have unlimited time. Identification and boarding credentials, immediately." Gradually, with intention, Lawrence extended his hand into the interior compartment of his coat. He extracted a weathered leather billfold. It appeared frayed from countless years of use. From within, he retrieved an identification document, discolored and encased in plastic so many occasions it had grown as thick as currency. He extended it forward. Lieutenant Miller seized it, elevating it toward the sunlight as though it were a questionable counterfeit. "Lawrence Owens," he announced aloud, a sneer forming on his mouth. "Rank ensign. This document expired before my parents came into the world." "This is worthless." He attempted to return it, but Lawrence made no move to accept it. "That vessel," Lawrence stated, his voice a subdued, gravelly murmur that appeared to drift on the ocean wind. "I was stationed on her predecessor, the original USS Courage. This is the 4th iteration. They extended an invitation to me." Miller laughed. A brief, harsh sound. "They invited you?" "I'm the boarding authority, and I can assure you that nobody bearing this name appears on my approved roster. We have distinguished officials, members of Congress, families of active personnel. We don't have an open invitation for historical relics." The offense lingered in the briny atmosphere. Several individuals in the assembly shifted uneasily. A young sailor accompanied by his spouse and infant attempted to maneuver past them, but the lieutenant raised his hand, resolute in making this elderly man an example. He was relishing the spectators, the limited domain of authority he was wielding on the sun-drenched dock. "Listen, Ensign," Miller stated, his inflection saturated with patronization as he stressed the junior designation. "I'm confident you were quite the champion in your era. Monochrome photographs, all of that. But today, this is my vessel, and lacking the appropriate documentation, you will not be stepping onto my boarding ramp. Why don't you locate the Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall? I'm certain they have refreshments and pastries available for you." Lawrence's composed demeanor remained unchanged, but a profound melancholy descended into his gaze. He had journeyed more than 1,000 miles for this occasion. He had awakened before sunrise, his aged frame aching, and donned his finest coat, the identical one he had worn to his wife's memorial service. He had arrived to bid farewell, to position himself on the platform of a ship that carried the designation of his long-departed home, and offer his tributes to the spirits who continued to voyage with him. And he was being obstructed by a youth who perceived only a figure, an age, a disruption. The lieutenant, encouraged by the old man's quietness, intensified his offensive. "What's this?" he inquired, his finger indicating toward a small darkened item fastened to Lawrence's lapel. It was a peculiar object, an irregularly shaped fragment of metal, tarnished and corroded with a basic clasp attached to the reverse. It resembled a piece of refuse. "You received that for flawless attendance at bingo?" The inquiry, so dismissive and merciless, appeared to suspend in the atmosphere for an eternity. For an instant, the radiant, noisy pier disappeared from Lawrence's perception. The aroma of popcorn and diesel vapors was supplanted by the harsh odor of gunpowder and ignited petroleum. The cheerful conversation of the assembly transformed into the thunderous blast of 5-inch cannons and the terrifying wail of approaching projectiles. He was 22 years of age once more, positioned on the command deck of the first USS Courage, the platform lurching beneath his footing like an untamed creature. The sky was not cerulean, but a sickly, smoke-saturated amber. He could sense the percussion of approximate detonation resonating through his dental work. Standing adjacent to him was Captain Evans, a man he venerated, whose countenance was brightened by the burst of an eruption. In the tumultuous consequences of that explosion, with the ship tilting and warning signals howling, the captain had regarded him, his eyes expanded with a frightening combination of admiration and dread. He had articulated something, but the utterances were consumed in the tumult of combat, a wordless tribute to a moment created in flame and disorder. The object on his lapel originated from that instant, a fragment of the ship's very essence, a shard of its offering. He blinked and the apparition vanished. He had returned to the pier, the sun pleasant on his countenance, the arrogant lieutenant observing him, anticipating a response. Lawrence didn't provide him one. He simply remained there, a quiet memorial to a history the youth could never fathom. The confrontation had now attracted considerable notice. The queue to embark had entirely halted. Individuals were whispering and mobile devices were beginning to surface. The small dark apertures directed at the spectacle transpiring at the base of the boarding ramp. Lieutenant Miller was experiencing the tension, but his arrogance wouldn't permit him to retreat. He had to prevail in this. "That's enough," he proclaimed, his voice escalating in volume. "You're generating a civil disturbance and obstructing a naval operation. I'm going to have you removed from the location." He motioned to a duo of masters-at-arms, the Navy's security personnel, who positioned themselves nearby, their expressions austere and detached. "Escort this individual to the security station. He's concluded here," but within the assembly, someone had observed and heard sufficient. Petty Officer Miller, unrelated to the lieutenant, was a young man, scarcely 20 himself, but he was an enthusiast of military history. He had consumed volumes about the Pacific Campaign, about the monumental naval engagements that had characterized the 20th century. When the lieutenant had vocalized the name from the identification document, Lawrence Owens, a mechanism had activated in his consciousness. It was a name he recognized, a name uttered with veneration in the corridors of the Naval Academy, a name connected to one of the most celebrated accounts of individual ship valor in the Navy's complete chronicle. It couldn't be the identical person, could it? The petty officer observed the old man's tranquil composure, his unwavering serenity in the presence of such degrading discourtesy. He observed the unusual pitted fragment of metal on his lapel. An account from a history instruction emerged in his recollection. An account about a young ensign, a descending ship, and a piece of fragmentation from an adversary projectile. His blood became frigid. While the lieutenant was occupied performing for the assembly and requesting the security detail, Petty Officer Miller retreated back through the congregation of individuals, his heart hammering against his rib cage. He discovered a comparatively secluded area behind a supply container and fumbled for his mobile device. He understood he was violating the command hierarchy, a transgression of the most serious nature. Bypassing a commissioned officer's authority could result in assignment to the most undesirable maintenance responsibilities in the fleet, or more severe consequences. But he couldn't simply observe idly. If he was mistaken, his career was terminated. But if he was accurate, permitting this to transpire would be a disgrace on the uniform he donned. His hands quivered as he navigated through his directory, locating the contact for the Admiral's station on the vessel. He hoped someone would respond. "Admiral Blackwood's office, aide speaking." The voice was professional and occupied. "Sir, this is Petty Officer Second Class Miller," he stammered, attempting to maintain his voice steady. "I'm on the pier at the boarding ramp for the USS Courage. Sir, there is a critical situation unfolding." "A critical situation, Petty Officer?" The aide's inflection was doubtful. "What is it?" "It's Lieutenant Miller, the boarding authority, sir. He's denying admission to a civilian, an elderly veteran. He's having him extracted by security personnel at this moment." There was an audible exhalation on the opposite end of the communication. "Petty Officer, I'm confident the lieutenant is adhering to procedure. I cannot disturb the Admiral for a visitor dispute." "Sir, please," Miller implored, his voice fracturing with desperation. "You don't comprehend. The veteran's name. It's Owens. Lawrence Owens." There was a suspension. The ambient noise on the opposite end of the communication appeared to recede away. "Articulate that name again, petty officer." "Owens, sir. Lawrence Owens." The communication went silent for several seconds. Petty Officer Miller retained his breath, his knuckles pallid as he clutched the device. He could detect the faint sound of a door unsealing and the aide's muted voice communicating rapidly, urgently to someone else. Then the aide was returned on the communication, his voice completely transformed. It was no longer disinterested and dismissive. It was saturated with a shocking electric urgency. "Petty Officer, where precisely are you? And where is Mr. Owens currently?" "He's at the base of the boarding ramp. The masters-at-arms are about to escort him away." "You maintain him there," the aide commanded, his voice penetrating as a blade. "Do not permit that man to depart the pier." "Do whatever you must. The Admiral is proceeding. I repeat, the Admiral is proceeding." The communication terminated. Petty Officer Miller stared at his device, a surge of terror and relief flooding over him. He had just ignited a match into a powder reservoir. Now all he could accomplish was anticipate the detonation. Inside the Admiral's expansive stateroom aboard the USS Courage, the atmosphere had transformed from calm productivity to regulated pandemonium in the duration of 30 seconds. Rear Admiral Blackwood, a man recognized for his unshakable composure and a chest adorned with ribbons that narrated the chronicle of 35 years of service, had been examining navigational charts for the fleet's departure. His aide, a young but exceptionally capable commander, burst in without announcing, his countenance ashen. "Admiral, I apologize for the disruption, but you need to receive this." Blackwood glanced up, irritated. "This had better be justified, Commander." "It's a communication from a petty officer on the pier," the aide stated breathlessly. "There's a boarding disagreement. A lieutenant is removing an elderly veteran." The Admiral's eyes constricted. "And this necessitates my personal involvement." "For what reason?" The aide swallowed with difficulty. "Sir, the veteran's name is Lawrence Owens." The name suspended in the climate-controlled quietness of the stateroom. Admiral Blackwood stared at his aide, his mind processing the intelligence. The name was recognizable, but from where? A historical text, a briefing. Then it registered. It wasn't merely a name. It was a legend. An account they conveyed at Annapolis to instruct cadets the definition of the word courage. A specter from the Navy's most illustrious and dreadful past. The Admiral gradually lowered the charts to his desk. The color evacuated from his countenance. "Owens," he repeated, his voice a disbelieving whisper. "As in the Battle of Samar, that Lawrence Owens." "The petty officer appears to believe so, sir." The Admiral shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the flooring. The unshakable commander was gone, replaced by a man galvanized by a profound sense of urgency and horror.
"Dear God in heaven, what is transpiring on my pier?"
He didn't anticipate an answer. "Commander, assemble the Marine Honor Guard. Full ceremonial attire. Meet me at the main boarding ramp 2 minutes ago. Retrieve the ship's captain. I want every officer on that pier to observe this. Move." The aide practically sprinted from the chamber, transmitting orders into his radio. Admiral Blackwood strode to his wardrobe, retrieving his formal coat and his admiral's cover. His mind accelerated. Lawrence Owens, alive and being humiliated on his watch. It was an inconceivable stain, a desecration against the very soul of the Navy. Down on the pier, Lieutenant Miller's moment of victory was at hand. The two masters-at-arms had reached Lawrence Owens, their presence imposing and intimidating. One of them, a broad-shouldered individual with a grave expression, spoke in a subdued, respectful tone that stood in stark contrast to the lieutenant's. "Sir, we need you to accompany us, please." Lawrence simply nodded, a weary resignation settling over him. He had anticipated this. The world had progressed, and there was minimal space remaining for old spirits. "See?" Lieutenant Miller said to the assembly, his arm extended wide as if presenting a conjuring trick. "This is what transpires when you don't adhere to the regulations. It's for everyone's protection." He then took a step forward and committed his final, irrevocable error. He positioned his hand on Lawrence's shoulder to guide him away, a gesture of patronizing authority that transgressed the boundary from verbal condescension to physical disrespect. "All right, grandfather, let's proceed." "Time for your rest." A collective inhalation went through the assembly. It was one thing to be discourteous, but to place hands on the fragile-looking elderly man was another matter. Entirely. But before the masters-at-arms could escort Lawrence away, a sound penetrated through the atmosphere, sharp and commanding. "Stand fast!" The directive boomed from the summit of the boarding ramp, amplified by the ship's public address system, reverberating across the entire pier. It was a voice that tolerated no contradiction. Every sailor, every officer, every person in uniform froze and instinctively snapped to attention. Lieutenant Miller rotated around, his hand dropping from Lawrence's shoulder as if it were ablaze. His countenance went vacant with confusion and then with emerging terror. Marching down the boarding ramp with a velocity and purpose that was breathtaking to witness was Rear Admiral Blackwood himself. His countenance was a storm cloud of controlled fury, his dress-white uniform immaculate, his chest a spectrum of valorous service. Flanking him were the ship's captain and his personal aide. Behind them, in perfect gleaming formation, marched 6 United States Marines in full ceremonial dress, their rifles held with practiced precision. The entire pier fell into a dead, shocked silence. The assembly, which had been a chaotic jumble of civilians and sailors, separated like the Red Sea. The spectacle was so sudden, so overwhelmingly official that no one knew what to do except observe. Admiral Blackwood's eyes swept over the scene, registering the cowering lieutenant, the confused masters-at-arms, and finally the small, still figure of Lawrence Owens. The Admiral didn't reduce his pace until he was 3 feet from Lawrence. He came to a perfect rigid halt. He did not acknowledge the lieutenant or anyone else. His eyes, clear and filled with a profound, unmistakable reverence, were fixed only on the elderly man. Then, in a move that sent a shockwave through the assembled crowd, Admiral Blackwood raised his hand to his brow and delivered the sharpest, most heartfelt salute of his long and decorated career. "Mr. Owens," his voice rang out clear and powerful for all to hear. "It is an honor, sir. A profound and humbling honor." At his signal, the captain, the aide, the Marine Honor Guard, and every other man and woman in uniform on that pier, including the 2 dumbstruck masters-at-arms, snapped into a salute. The only uniformed person not saluting was Lieutenant Miller, who stood frozen, his mind incapable of processing what was occurring. Admiral Blackwood held his salute for an extended moment before gradually lowering his hand. He turned to face the silent, bewildered crowd. "For those of you who are unaware," he began, his voice resonating with the gravity of a history lesson, "you are in the presence of a giant. You are standing before Ensign Lawrence Owens, United States Navy, retired." He paused, allowing the name and rank to penetrate. In October of 1944, during the Battle of Samar, Mr. Owens was the most junior officer on the bridge of the destroyer escort USS Courage. His ship, along with a handful of others in a unit designated Taffy 3, found themselves confronting the entire Japanese center force, a fleet of battleships and heavy cruisers that should have obliterated them in minutes. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and virtually defenseless. The Admiral's gaze fell upon the young sailors in the crowd, his eyes compelling them to understand. In the first salvo, a shell from the battleship Yamato struck the Courage's bridge, killing the captain and every senior officer instantly. The ship was on fire and sinking. Command fell to a 22-year-old ensign. "This man," he gestured to Lawrence. With his ship shattered and his crew dying around him, Ensign Owens refused to retreat. He took command, rallied the survivors, and ordered his ship to charge directly at a line of Japanese cruisers. For 2 hours he held them off, weaving through shell splashes, laying smoke, and firing his single remaining gun until it ran out of ammunition. His actions drew the fire of the heavy cruisers, allowing the small escort carriers he was protecting to escape. He saved hundreds of American lives that day at the cost of his own ship and most of his crew. The Admiral stepped closer to Lawrence and gently indicated the small, dark object on his lapel. "Lieutenant Miller," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level as he finally addressed the young officer. "You asked what this was. This is not a prize from a bingo game. This is a piece of shrapnel from the Japanese cruiser Haguro. It was embedded in the bulkhead 2 inches from Mr. Owens's head. He keeps it not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the 87 shipmates he lost that day." A wave of awe and shame washed over the pier. The faces in the crowd, once just curious, were now filled with reverence. They were looking at Lawrence not as an old man, but as the living embodiment of the ship's name, Courage. Admiral Blackwood turned his full wrathful attention to Lieutenant Miller, whose face had crumpled into a mask of pure horror. The Admiral's voice was low, but each word was a hammer blow. "Lieutenant, you are an embarrassment to the uniform I wear, to the traditions I uphold, and to the memory of the men who died under Mr. Owens's command. You stand on a pier named for fallen heroes, serving on a ship christened in honor of valor, and you saw nothing but a nuisance. You looked at this man and saw his age, not his sacrifice. You saw a worn-out jacket, not a hero's mantle. Your obsession with regulations has made you blind to the one thing that gives those regulations meaning: honor." The Admiral leaned in close. "You will report to my office at 0600 tomorrow morning. You will be relieved of your duties on this ship, and you will spend the remainder of your tour contemplating the difference between having authority and having honor. Dismissed." As the disgraced lieutenant stumbled away, his career in ruins, Lawrence Owens finally spoke. His voice was soft, yet it carried across the silent pier. "Admiral," he said, looking not at the retreating lieutenant, but at the high-ranking officer before him. "He's just a boy, eager to do his job right. The failure isn't his alone. Maybe the regulations, the books we give them, have forgotten how to describe what real service looks like off the page." Lawrence then turned his calm, forgiving eyes toward the crowd. He gently touched the piece of shrapnel on his lapel. "Respect isn't in a rule book," he said, his voice raspy with emotion. "It's in here." He tapped a finger over his heart. "You don't learn it by shouting. You learn it by listening to the stories of those who came before." As he touched the pin, another memory, sharper than the last, flashed in his mind. He wasn't on the bridge in the heart of the battle, but on a makeshift life raft days later, adrift in the vast, empty Pacific. The sun beat down on his burned skin. He was clutching that same jagged piece of metal, still warm from the fires that had consumed his ship. He wasn't thinking of victory or heroism. He was thinking of the faces of his friends, his shipmates, now lost to the deep. The piece of metal wasn't a souvenir. It was a promise to remember them, a promise to live a life worthy of their sacrifice. In the aftermath, Lawrence Owens was escorted aboard the USS Courage, not as a guest, but as a returning king. Admiral Blackwood himself gave him a personal tour, the crew lining the passageways to salute him as he passed. The story of what happened on the pier spread through the fleet like wildfire. Within a week, the Navy officially issued a formal public apology to Mr. Owens. Inspired and deeply shamed by the incident, Admiral Blackwood used his considerable influence to enact a new fleet-wide mandate. The Owens Initiative, as it came to be called, was a mandatory naval heritage program for all junior officers. It focused not on dates and battles, but on the personal stories of living veterans, ensuring that the new generation of naval leadership would learn to see the hero behind the weathered face. The former Lieutenant Miller was not discharged. Instead, in a stroke of poetic justice, he was reassigned to a dreary desk job at a naval archive and tasked with organizing the curriculum for the very first Owens Initiative seminar. His punishment was not to be exiled, but to be educated, forced to learn the lesson he had so publicly and painfully failed. 6 months later, in a quiet diner in a small town hundreds of miles from the sea, Lawrence Owens was sitting in his usual booth, nursing a cup of coffee. The bell above the door chimed, and a young man in civilian clothes walked in. He looked different without his uniform, smaller and less sure of himself. He scanned the room, and his eyes landed on Lawrence. It was Miller. He hesitated for a long moment, then walked slowly to the booth. He stood by the table, his hands fidgeting. He didn't speak for a full minute. Then he went to the counter, bought a cup of coffee, and brought it back, placing it on the table in front of Lawrence. "Mr. Owens," he said, his voice quiet and choked with a humility he had not possessed before. "I just wanted to say thank you." Lawrence looked up from his cup, his eyes holding no trace of anger or resentment. He simply gave a slight nod of acknowledgement, a silent acceptance of an apology that needed no more words. The lesson had been learned. The circle was closed. The stories of heroes like Lawrence Owens remind us that valor is timeless, and that true respect is earned not by the rank on one's collar, but by the courage in one's heart. If this story moved you, please give it a like, share it with others, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more tales of unassuming heroes.